The Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with Friday morning chaos, families reuniting, harried travelers rushing to gates, and the metallic hum of announcements echoing overhead. Daniel Carter stood in the center of it all, a picture of perfection. His tailored suit clung to his athletic frame, his gold cufflinks catching the morning sunlight that filtered through the high glass ceiling. A casual observer might see him as a man who had it all, a self-made billionaire with an empire spanning continents. But beneath the polished exterior, Daniel was haunted. He carried the weight of his choices like an invisible chain, each link forged from regret and loneliness. Sipping his overpriced coffee, Daniel stared out at the bustling terminal, his mind far from his upcoming business deal in Tokyo. It was then, amidst the blur of travelers, that he saw her. Laura. The sight hit him like a thunderclap. She hadn't changed much in 10 years. Her auburn hair still framed her face like a halo, and her determined stride radiated an elegance he once adored. But it wasn't just Laura that froze him in place. Walking beside her was a boy, no older than 10, with tousled dark hair and bright green eyes that mirrored his own from decades past. Time seemed to halt as memories crashed over him. The fights, the nights he spent chasing deals instead of dreams with her, the cruel note he left behind, the one that ended everything. His chest tightened as guilt clawed at his insides, a visceral reminder of the life he abandoned in pursuit of ambition. He took a step forward, then another, his heart hammering in his chest. What were they doing here? Was the boy his? But the bustling crowd conspired against him. A group of tourists shuffled past with oversized suitcases, blocking his view. Panic set in. He craned his neck, searching desperately, but Laura and the boy were gone. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, weaving through the throng. Each second felt like an eternity. He caught a glimpse of Laura's auburn hair as she turned a corner near Gate 14. Fueled by desperation, he broke into a jog, only to find the space empty. Daniel stood motionless, his breath shallow, his pulse racing. They had disappeared. His hands clenched into fists as emotions he'd long buried surged to the surface. Shame, longing, and a gnawing sense of unfinished business. 10 years earlier, the world looked vastly different to Daniel Carter. Back then, he was a man driven not by regret, but by unrelenting ambition, a fire that burned so fiercely it consumed everything in its path, including love. Laura had been his anchor, a grounding force in the chaos of his ascent. They met in a small cafe in downtown Chicago, where her quiet smile and unassuming charm drew him in. She was everything Daniel wasn't, simple, content, and deeply connected to life's little joys. Their love story began in that humble setting, where late-night talks over cheap coffee felt more valuable than any deal Daniel would later close. But as his business ventures flourished, Daniel's priorities shifted. Lavish boardrooms replaced their cozy apartment. Extravagant parties, exclusive events, and influential circles became his new normal. He promised it was all for their future, that the sacrifices would pay off. But Laura saw the cracks forming. "You don't see it, do you?" she asked one night, her voice trembling with frustration. "You're losing yourself, Daniel. And you're losing us." Daniel dismissed her concerns, brushing off her words as an inability to understand his drive. In truth, her simplicity began to feel like a weight, a reminder of the man he once was but no longer aspired to be. It was around this time that Sophia Bennett entered his life. She was the embodiment of everything Daniel thought he wanted: elegant, sharp, and unapologetically ambitious. Sophia was a woman who spoke his language, her every word dripping with promises of power and wealth. She painted vivid pictures of a future where Daniel could sit at the apex of society, unburdened by limitations or compromises. Sophia's allure wasn't just in her beauty, but in her ability to stoke the flames of Daniel's ambition. With her, he felt invincible, as though the world was his for the taking. The quieter life Laura offered began to seem mundane, even suffocating. One fateful night, after yet another argument with Laura about his late hours and emotional distance, Daniel made his decision. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was cold, calculated, and devoid of emotion, the kind of decision a man consumed by ambition makes. The next morning, Laura woke up to find a letter on the kitchen table. Daniel's words were curt and final. "I can't do this anymore. I need to focus on what matters to me. I hope you find someone who values what you want in life, but it isn't me." What Daniel didn't know, what he never allowed himself to consider, was that Laura was carrying his child. As Daniel drove away that morning, his eyes fixed on the glittering skyline of opportunity ahead, he didn't look back. He convinced himself it was the right choice, that sacrificing love for success was a necessary evil. Sophia was waiting, ready to usher him into a world of luxury and excess, a world where emotions were liabilities and ambition reigned supreme. Daniel couldn't shake the image of Laura and the boy. The brief encounter at the airport had ignited something dormant within him, a mixture of longing, guilt, and an insatiable need for answers. He spent days replaying the moment in his mind, the boy's familiar features haunting his every waking thought. It wasn't just a coincidence. Deep down, he knew the truth. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of urgency that had nothing to do with a business deal. Determined to unravel the mystery, he made a call to Mike Reynolds, a seasoned private investigator known for his discretion and results. "I need you to find someone for me," Daniel said, his voice low and deliberate. Mike listened intently as Daniel described Laura and the boy. The investigator's silence suggested he had encountered this type of case before, a man chasing shadows of a past he couldn't change. "Give me a week," Mike replied. The days that followed were excruciating. For a man used to controlling every aspect of his life, Daniel found himself uncomfortably powerless. His once impeccable routine crumbled as memories of Laura began to resurface with startling clarity. He remembered the way she laughed, the way her hand fit perfectly in his. He also remembered the nights she cried alone while he worked late, and the mornings when her hopeful eyes were met with his cold indifference. The image of her reading his letter, the final blow, burned in his mind. The walls of his penthouse apartment, adorned with art pieces that screamed wealth, felt suffocating. The silence was deafening. It hit him like a freight train. He had everything, yet nothing at all. By the end of the week, Mike called. "I've got something," he said. Daniel drove to Mike's office with a mix of dread and anticipation. The investigator handed him a folder, thick with photographs and notes. "She's living in Fairhaven," Mike said, "a small town about 2 hours from here. She's got a house, works as a graphic designer, and she's not alone." Daniel's grip tightened on the folder. "She has a boyfriend," Mike continued, hesitating for a moment. "His name is James Porter. They've been together for a few years. And the boy? His name is Jacob. He's 10. Daniel stared at the photos. Laura smiling on a park bench, Jacob laughing as he played soccer, James standing beside them, his arm draped protectively over Laura's shoulders. A wave of emotions crashed over him. Relief that Laura and Jacob seemed happy, anguish that he hadn't been part of their lives, and jealousy, pure, unfiltered jealousy, that another man had stepped in where he had failed. He spent the night pacing his apartment, the photos spread across his desk. He couldn't stop staring at Jacob's face. The resemblance was undeniable. What was he supposed to do? Show up unannounced and demand a place in their lives? He had no right. Yet the thought of walking away again felt unbearable. For the first time, Daniel Carter, billionaire, businessman, and self-proclaimed master of his destiny, had no idea what to do. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore this second chance. He had to face the life he abandoned, no matter how much it hurt. 10 years earlier, when Laura Carter discovered she was pregnant, she was alone in every sense of the word. The man she had loved, the father of her unborn child, had vanished, leaving behind only a cold letter and a void in her heart. For weeks, she refused to believe he was truly gone. She checked her phone obsessively, expecting a call, a text, or even an apology. But none came. When the reality finally settled, Laura faced an uncertain future. Pregnant, jobless, and emotionally shattered, She moved out of the apartment she once shared with Daniel and back into the small, modest home she had grown up in. She found work where she could, waitressing, freelance designing, even cleaning houses, anything to save enough money to provide for the child growing inside her. The birth of Jacob brought both joy and struggle. From the moment she held him, Laura vowed to give him the best life she could. He had Daniel's piercing green eyes and unruly dark hair, but the resemblance didn't sting as much as she feared. Instead, it became a source of strength. She wasn't alone anymore. Jacob gave her purpose. The first few years were the hardest. There were nights when Laura went to bed hungry to ensure Jacob had enough to eat, and days when exhaustion from juggling jobs made her feel like she was failing. But Jacob thrived, his curiosity and boundless energy lighting up even the darkest moments. It was during one of those trying times when Laura's car had broken down and her landlord was threatening eviction that James Porter entered her life. James was a mechanic with a kind smile and an easygoing nature. He fixed her car at a fraction of the cost, but what truly struck Laura was how he treated Jacob, kneeling to the boy's level, joking about superhero capes, and offering him a lollipop. Over time, James became more than just a helping hand. He was steady, reliable, and patient, everything Laura needed but hadn't dared to hope for. He never pried about her past, never pressured her to talk about the man who had left her. Instead, he focused on the present, supporting Laura in ways both big and small. When Jacob started school, James was there to cheer him on at soccer games and help with homework. But while Jacob adored James, there was always a quiet sadness in the boy, a longing Laura couldn't soothe. Jacob never asked about his father directly, but Laura could see the questions in his eyes whenever he noticed other kids with their dads. "I don't have a dad, do I?" Jacob asked one evening, his voice small but curious. Laura froze, her chest tightening. "You have me," she said softly, pulling him into a hug. "And James, that's what matters." Jacob didn't press further, but Laura knew the subject wasn't closed. How could she explain to her son that the man who had abandoned them was out there, living a life of unimaginable wealth and power? By the time Jacob turned 10, Laura had built a stable life in Fairhaven. She had a home, a steady income as a graphic designer, and James by her side. Yet, every now and then, she caught Jacob staring at the stars with a wistful expression that made her heart ache. Laura had done everything she could to protect her son from the pain of Daniel's absence. What she didn't know was that the man she had tried to forget was about to come crashing back into their lives. Daniel sat in his car on the quiet suburban street, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Through the windshield, he could see Laura's modest home, its porch light glowing softly in the early evening. A soccer ball lay forgotten in the yard, and the sound of laughter spilled out through the open windows. It was a life he had no part in, yet one he couldn't stop imagining himself inside. For hours he had debated whether he should knock on that door or simply drive away, but the ache in his chest wouldn't let him leave. He needed answers. He needed to see Jacob, his son. Finally, Daniel stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. His heart pounded in his chest as he rehearsed what he would say. 1,000 scenarios played in his mind, none of them ending well. As he reached the porch, the door opened. Laura stepped outside, a bag of trash in hand. When her eyes landed on him, she froze. "Daniel," she said, her voice laced with disbelief and something colder, resentment. "Laura," he began, his voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't be here, but—" "You shouldn't," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "What are you doing here?" Daniel hesitated, searching for the right words. "I saw you at the airport. I saw him. Laura, I had to come. I needed to know." Her eyes narrowed and she took a step forward, her anger simmering just below the surface. "You needed to know? 10 years, Daniel. 10 years of silence. And now you suddenly need to know." "I didn't know about Jacob," Daniel said quickly, his voice desperate. If you had known—" Laura cut him off, her voice rising. "What? You'd have sent a check? You'd have swooped in between board meetings to play the hero? You left, Daniel. You chose a different life. You don't get to come back and disrupt everything now. I just want to see him, Daniel pleaded. Please, Laura, let me meet my son. Your son? Laura's voice cracked with emotion. You don't have a son, Daniel. Jacob doesn't know you. He doesn't need you. Before Daniel could respond, the front door opened and James stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding yet calm. His eyes flicked between Daniel and Laura, quickly assessing the situation. Everything okay out here? James asked, his voice steady but protective. Laura crossed her arms, her body language rigid. Daniel was just leaving. James took a step closer, positioning himself slightly in front of Laura. You heard her, he said firmly. Whatever you think you're doing, don't. They don't need you messing with their lives. Daniel felt the weight of James's words like a punch to the gut. He looked at Laura, hoping for a glimmer of understanding, but her expression was stone cold. I just want a chance, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. You had your chance, Laura replied. You threw it away. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, without another word, Laura turned and walked inside, James following her and closing the door firmly behind him. Daniel stood there, staring at the closed door, his chest tight with a mixture of pain and regret. He had come seeking redemption, but all he had found was the wreckage of the life he had abandoned. The tension in Laura's house was palpable. After Daniel's unexpected appearance, Laura sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at Jacob. He was busy sketching superheroes in his notebook, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Jacob, Laura began, her voice unsteady. Yeah, Mom, he replied without looking up, his pencil moving swiftly across the page. Laura hesitated, her heart aching. How could she explain something so complex to a 10-year-old? But she knew she couldn't delay any longer. Daniel's arrival had changed everything. Sweetheart, she said, her tone soft but serious. There's something I need to tell you. It's about your father. Jacob froze, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. Slowly, he looked up, his green eyes, so much like Daniel's, locking onto hers. My father? Laura nodded. The man who came to the house earlier. His name is Daniel. He's your father. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Jacob's brows furrowed, confusion flashing across his face. No, he said, shaking his head. That's not right. James is my dad. Laura's chest tightened. James loves you like a father, Jacob, and he's been there for you in every way that matters. But Daniel is your biological father. He's the man I was with before you were born. The color drained from Jacob's face. Why hasn't he been here? Why didn't he want me? Laura reached out, but Jacob pulled back, his voice rising. You lied to me. No, Jacob, Laura said quickly. I was trying to protect you. Daniel didn't know about you. He left before I could tell him. He didn't know? Or he didn't care? Jacob interrupted, his voice sharp with anger. Laura's heart broke as she watched her son grapple with emotions too big for him to understand. He's trying to make things right now, she said softly. But Jacob wasn't ready to hear it. He pushed back his chair and stormed out of the room, slamming the door to his bedroom behind him. The next day, Daniel stood outside Jacob's school, clutching the courage to approach him. When the bell rang, kids poured out, laughing and chatting. Jacob emerged, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Jacob, Daniel called hesitantly. Jacob stopped, his face darkening when he saw Daniel. What do you want? He demanded, his voice sharp. Daniel took a tentative step forward. I just want to talk, please. Jacob glared at him. You've had 10 years to talk. Where were you then? Do you know what it feels like to watch everyone else have a dad and wonder why yours doesn't care enough to show up? Daniel's chest tightened. I didn't know, Jacob. I didn't know about you. And if you did, Jacob shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. Would you have stayed? Or would you have left like you left my mom? Daniel couldn't answer. The truth was, He didn't know what he would have done back then. "You're a coward," Jacob spat. "You don't deserve to be my dad." The words hit Daniel like a sledgehammer. He stood frozen, watching as Jacob walked away, his small frame tense with anger. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt utterly powerless. The son he had longed to meet hated him, and it was entirely his fault. As he turned to leave, a single tear slid down his face, a stark reminder of the damage his choices had caused. Daniel's life unraveled in a matter of days. It began with an article. A flashy headline splashed across every major news outlet. "Billionaire's shady past exposed. Financial crimes, fraud, and deception." At first, Daniel dismissed it as a smear campaign, just another baseless attack on his success. But as more reports surfaced, he realized the truth. Sophia Bennett was behind it. Sophia, furious that Daniel had walked away from their glamorous life together, had decided to destroy him. She leaked years' worth of damning evidence, revealing the questionable deals and underhanded tactics Daniel had employed in his rise to wealth. Emails, documents, and witness testimonies painted a picture of a man willing to sacrifice morality for success. The fallout was swift and brutal. Investors pulled out of his companies, his board of directors resigned en masse, and the media descended like vultures. Cameras followed his every move, reporters shouting accusations as he walked the halls of his now crumbling empire. But the worst part wasn't the loss of his fortune. It was the chaos it brought to Laura and Jacob. Within days, their quiet home in Fairhaven was swarmed by journalists. Photographers camped outside their yard, snapping pictures of Jacob as he left for school, and tabloid headlines speculated on the boy's connection to the disgraced billionaire. Laura's phone rang incessantly, reporters hounding her for a comment. "Why couldn't you just stay away?" Laura demanded when Daniel called her in desperation. Her voice was heavy with exhaustion and anger. "You've turned our lives into a circus." "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice hollow. "I never wanted this to happen." "Want doesn't matter," she snapped. "Fix it, Daniel, before it destroys Jacob." The next morning, Daniel made his decision. For the first time in his life, he stopped running from his mistakes. He held a press conference in front of a courthouse, his once flawless suit wrinkled and his face etched with fatigue. "I'm here to take responsibility for my actions," Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "In my pursuit of success, I made choices that hurt people. I lied, I cheated, and I failed to uphold the principles I once believed in. I deeply regret the pain I've caused, especially to my family. Today I'm turning myself in and cooperating fully with the authorities." The cameras flashed furiously, capturing the moment as Daniel surrendered to law enforcement. The world watched as the billionaire was led away in handcuffs, his fall from grace complete. Months passed. Daniel sat in a stark prison cell, stripped of his wealth and power. But for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He had nothing left to lose, and in that emptiness, he found clarity. One rainy afternoon, a guard appeared at his cell door. "Carter, you've got a visitor." Daniel's heart skipped. When he stepped into the visitation room, he froze. Jacob was sitting at the table, his small hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Jacob," Daniel breathed, his voice cracking. Jacob looked up, his expression hesitant but not angry. "Mom said I didn't have to come," he said quietly. "But I wanted to." Daniel sat down across from his son, tears pooling in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Jacob," he whispered, "for everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but—" "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," Jacob interrupted, his voice steady. "But I think maybe we can start over." Daniel's throat tightened as he nodded. "I'd like that," he said. For the first time, father and son shared a tentative but genuine connection. It was fragile, but it was real, a glimmer of hope in the ruins of Daniel's life. The sun was warm on Daniel's face as he stepped out of the prison gates. A duffel bag slung over his shoulder held the sum of his belongings, but it wasn't his past he carried anymore. It was hope. His time behind bars had stripped him of material wealth, but given him something far more valuable: perspective. In the months following his release, Daniel threw himself into rebuilding his life. Gone were the grand ambitions of power and prestige. Instead, he found purpose in helping others. He partnered with community organizations, using his financial knowledge to guide struggling small businesses and mentor young entrepreneurs. Slowly, he began to rebuild not just his reputation, but his character. His relationship with Jacob was fragile but growing. Letters exchanged during his imprisonment had planted the seeds of trust, and now, free to see each other, father and son began to bridge the gap that years of absence had created. Meanwhile, Laura and James continued to provide Jacob with a stable, loving home. James remained a steadfast presence, a man who put family first in a way Daniel had once failed to do. But rather than resentment, Daniel found gratitude for the role James played in Jacob's life. Over time, the three adults formed an unusual but functional partnership, united by their shared love for Jacob. One crisp autumn evening, Daniel arrived at Jacob's school for a special event. The gymnasium buzzed with activity as proud parents filled the seats. Daniel stood at the back, his hands clasped, watching as Jacob took the stage to receive an award for academic excellence. Laura and James sat in the front row, beaming with pride. But as Jacob scanned the crowd, his eyes found Daniel. A small smile played on his lips, and he gave the slightest nod. Daniel's chest swelled with emotion. He had lost so much, yet here was his son, a reflection of his past and the promise of his future. As the applause filled the room, Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of peace. He wasn't front and center, wasn't the focus of attention. He was simply there, standing quietly in the background, a father finally present. When Jacob descended the stage, Laura, James, and Daniel exchanged a brief glance. There were no words, just an understanding. They had come full circle, a family redefined not by convention, but by love and resilience. For the first time in years, Daniel smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. It wasn't the wealth or the power that had defined him. It was this, a second chance, a new beginning. Did this story resonate with you? If you were in Daniel's shoes, how would you face the weight of past mistakes and seek redemption? Or if you were Laura, how would you balance forgiveness and protecting your family? Jacob's journey is equally powerful. What would it take for you to open your heart to someone who had hurt you? If you were to rate this story, what score would you give it? Your feedback matters to me, and your thoughts can shape how I create even more compelling and meaningful tales in the future. Take a moment to share your reflections. What moved you? What could have been better? And what lessons you took away? Your support means everything. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. By doing so, you'll be the first to hear more captivating stories filled with emotion, drama, and the twists that keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for being part of this journey, and may your day be filled with inspiration and positivity.